the story of Sarah and Miss Thompson.
I never thought I would find myself in this situation.
Growing up in a small town, I always dreamed of a simple, happy life. I married Adam, my college sweetheart, when we were both young and full of hope. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough. Or so I thought. Looking back now, I can see the signs of what was coming. But at the time, I couldn't have imagined our life was perfect. Or at least I thought it was. We moved into a small house, just the two of us. It wasn't much, but it was ours. I loved the little backyard, the charm of the place. It felt like a new beginning for us. And then there was Mr. Thompson, our landlord. He was older, in his 60s, with a friendly smile that made him seem trustworthy. He would drop by now and then, just to check if everything was okay with the house. He was kind, always making small talk, but at the time, I didn't think anything of it. But as days turned into weeks, things began to change. Adam's job kept him away more and more, and soon I found myself spending a lot of time alone. It wasn't that I was unhappy, but I began to feel a sense of loneliness creeping in. The house, which once felt full of life, started feeling emptier without Adam around. It was during those times that I started noticing Mr. Thompson more. His visits became more frequent, and I couldn't help but feel something was off. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just an old man who wanted to be friendly. But his presence started to feel different. He'd show up unannounced, sometimes to check on the house, sometimes just to chat. And each time I noticed something new, something that made me feel uneasy. One afternoon, I was in the backyard, gardening. When he showed up, he had come by more than usual lately, but today was different. He stayed longer than usual. We talked about everything. The weather, the garden, and then about life. And that's when it happened. He looked at me in a way that made me feel exposed. "Are you happy here?" he asked. At that moment, I didn't know what to say. Of course, I was happy with Adam. But the truth was, something was missing, and I wasn't sure if it was me or if it was Adam. But I was feeling something. A distance. I smiled, tried to brush it off, but his question stayed with me long after he left. He didn't let it go. It's easy to forget how important it is to have someone to talk to, he said, his voice soft, almost like he was trying to say something more. I couldn't explain it, but there was something about the way he said it that made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just a harmless conversation, but the more I saw him, the more I started to feel his attention shift from friendly to something else. Compliments about how nice I looked, how well I took care of the house. They seemed innocent at first, but then they began to feel like something more. Something that made my heart race in a way I didn't want it to. And then one evening, Adam was away on business, and the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened the door, there he was, Mr. Thompson, standing there with that same smile. "I was just in the neighborhood," he said. "Thought I'd stop by, make sure everything's okay." I didn't think much of it. He'd been over before, so I let him in. But this time, there was a tension in the air, something I couldn't ignore. He sat down on the couch, closer than usual, and as we talked, I couldn't help but notice the way he looked at me. It wasn't the way a neighbor looks at you. It was different. He leaned in a little, and I could feel his presence getting closer. "You know," he said, "it's rare to meet someone like you, someone who really listens, someone who truly cares." I froze. The words were kind, but the way he said them made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the compliment. It was the way he looked at me. The way he made me feel like I was something more to him than just his tenant. I laughed nervously, trying to pull away. I curled my legs up on the couch, trying to create some distance between us, even if it was just physical. But he noticed, of course, and for a moment there was this strange, uncomfortable silence. He looked at me with soft eyes, but there was a sharpness behind them I couldn't ignore. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said. His voice was soft, but there was an edge to it. I just wanted you to know you're appreciated. You're a very special person, Sarah." His words hit me like a punch in the stomach. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to run, to shut the door in his face, but another part of me was frozen, unsure of what to do. I had never felt so conflicted in my life. The days that followed were filled with confusion. I couldn't stop thinking about the way Mr. Thompson had looked at me, the way his words had made me feel. Part of me was angry at myself for letting it get this far, angry at him for crossing boundaries I didn't even know I had. But another part of me, a part I didn't want to acknowledge, felt something more, something dangerous. I didn't know what to do. Should I tell Adam, or should I just brush it off like I had before? The truth was, I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. Every time Mr. Thompson came by, I felt the weight of the situation grow heavier. He was no longer just our landlord. He was someone who had crossed a line, and I didn't know how to get back from it. One evening, after another long day spent in silence, I sat in the living room with my mind racing. The house felt emptier than ever. Despite its warm, inviting walls, I was just about to pour myself a cup of tea when the doorbell rang again. My heart skipped a beat, and before I could stop myself, I was walking toward the door. There he was, Mr. Thompson, standing on my doorstep with that same warm smile that had started to make my skin crawl. He greeted me, as usual, with a polite "good evening, Sarah." But there was something different this time. There was a hesitation in his voice, a nervousness that hadn't been there before. "I was just in the neighborhood," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Thought I'd stop by and make sure everything is okay." I stepped aside to let him in, my stomach in knots. As he walked past me into the living room, I noticed that his eyes were no longer just friendly. They were searching, as though looking for something in me that I couldn't name. He took a seat on the couch, as he usually did. But this time, the space between us felt too small. There was no small talk, no pleasantries. It was just silence. And then, finally, he spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said." Mr. Thompson began slowly, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "About being happy. About feeling like someone's really listening." My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what he was saying. This wasn't just about checking in on the house anymore. This was about something else entirely, and I was no longer sure where the line between landlord and friend had blurred. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he continued, his voice low. "But I have to tell you, Sarah, I admire you. I admire the way you carry yourself, the way you take care of everything around here. You're remarkable." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I wanted to stand up, to leave the room, but my legs were frozen in place. His gaze was so intense, so unwavering, that I couldn't look away. I had to say something. But what? How could I explain that I wasn't interested? That I wasn't some object for him to admire? Mr. Thompson," I stammered, struggling to find my words. "I'm married. I'm committed to my husband. The words hung in the air between us. But he didn't back down. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, as if trying to make a connection that went beyond the professional boundaries we were supposed to have. I understand, he said softly, his tone almost apologetic. But I had to tell you how I feel. I can't pretend that I don't care about you. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to run away. But instead, I felt myself frozen in that moment, trapped by his words and the weight of the situation. I had to be firm. I had to draw the line. Miss Thompson, I said, my voice trembling but resolute. I appreciate your kindness, but I need you to understand something. I am married. I love my husband. And I am not interested in anything beyond the landlord-tenant relationship. For a moment, he didn't say anything. His expression softened, but there was still something in his eyes, something I couldn't ignore. I understand, he finally said, his voice low. I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable. That was never my intention. I nodded, the tension between us still thick in the air. Please, I said quietly, I need you to respect my boundaries. He stood up, and I followed suit. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. I won't bother you again, he said, though there was an almost sad finality in his tone. I watched him leave, my heart heavy with the weight of everything that had just transpired. I had set my boundary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. In the days that followed, things seemed to return to normal. Mr. Thompson stopped visiting so frequently, and I felt the weight of the situation lift. Though I couldn't shake the unease, Adam came home more often, and I focused on rebuilding the connection we had lost in the midst of all the confusion. I didn't share what had happened with him. Part of me feared that he would think I was being dramatic, that he would accuse me of overreacting. But I knew that I couldn't let Mr. Thompson's feelings cloud my marriage. And so life moved on. There was a new sense of peace in our home. But I also knew that I had learned something important. I had learned to trust my instincts, to set boundaries, and most of all, to protect what mattered most, my marriage with Adam. As I sat with him that evening, watching him smile and listening to his stories, I realized that no matter the challenges, we would get through this together. Because love, true love, is built on trust and respect, and that was something I would never let go.